All right, so I guess it will let me record here. I will share my screen up here. And okay, so I just have sort of a blank file here. It doesn't really matter what we're looking at. This is just sort of a test file that I've been playing around with for different things. Anyway, I want to talk about model precision and accuracy. And I know that this has sort of been covered over and over and over again, but it, as usual, bears repeating. And I think there's probably a few things in here that most people don't do or are not aware of or oftentimes forget about. The first thing, the most obvious, when we want to be accurate in our model, first of all, make sure that your rotation down here at the bottom, we see that I'm at 0. And then keep an eye on your tracker. Use that tracker. If I hold down shift, everybody should know this right now. If I hold down shift, I can see that no matter where the mouse goes, I'm on that 90-degree axis. It can happen to where if you catch a reference guide, it's going to try and find the relationship between that reference guide. And if that's off by let's just say quarter of an inch, which might be an actual increment that we would see in our model. If it's off by quarter of an inch over a 200-foot distance, it might still look 90 degrees. So keep an eye on that angle tracker. If it doesn't want to seem to lock to the 90 degrees, you can type A and type 90 and then R. And typing A will lock it as well. So using that tracker properly to keep your model orthogonal and square is really important. Now let's just say, for example, we have a project that has a wing. I'm just going to rotate this down 30 degrees, right? You should have your work environment set to every 15 degrees, but if it's not, what you can do is these drafting aids right here. This is actually, if you don't see those in your toolbars in your work environment, it's under Window, Palettes, and Drafting Aids. Or sorry, not palettes, toolbars, drafting aids. That'll be this palette right here. So if this is an angle that's not part of your work environment cursor guides, or if it's not at a 15-degree increment, what you can do is click on the perpendicular, and then you get that Mercedes cursor. I can click on that, and now I'm locked to 90 degrees from that axis. So that can be a useful guide. If I'm drawing a wall here, same thing, I can say that this is parallel to this, and it'll lock to that parallel. So those drafting aids can be very useful. This other one right here, the snap guides, can turn snap guides on and off. These will give you basically division points. Sometimes I've been seeing this get a little bit wonky where it doesn't want to actually highlight the point. It's just that temporary tick mark that I can snap to at the midpoint. What you can do there is turn it off and back on. You can reset your work environment, restart your computer sometimes. But I have seen these drafting guides get a little bit off. If I want to use the drafting guides to find a midpoint between two elements, say I want a wall halfway between this intersection point and that intersection point, you could set this to intersect or find the midpoint between the intersection points, right? And that's not going to be the middle of the wall. That's going to be the middle of these intersection points. So those drafting guides can be another useful trick for modeling accurately. Another sort of aid that oftentimes gets forgotten about or not realized, this has to do with if you're doing like preliminary site modeling or terrain modeling or things like that, and you're working in floor plans. So here I just have a mesh. Obviously, we would have a mesh with contours, but this has some grade adjustment. If I want to snap, say, a railing or columns or objects to this mesh and know that they're going to float on that mesh, right? If I just click here, its relationship is to Project Zero and Home Story. So if I look at that and this together, I can see that that has no bearing at all on its relationship to the mesh. It's at the home story, same as the mesh is. Now, if you have a whole bunch of these, say site walls, fences, I use trees a lot, columns as trees a lot in Archicad. So place the column, and then when it goes into twin motion, that gets replaced. But I do want to make sure that these are all sitting on the mesh and not like buried in if it's on the way uphill side. So what you could do there is select your column, and then this gravity tool right here, I can go gravity to mesh. And this also works for gravity to roof. If you have slabs that are above or below home story and you don't want to sit there and pick apart what elevation they're exactly at, you can go gravity to shell, to slab as well. I've never once used gravity to shell, but that's probably because we don't use shells very often. Anyway, now if I want to place columns. Oh, and you can see that this one actually shot way up because that's where the mesh goes up above its home story. So you might need to say that that's all stories or set that to a relevant story to get that to show up. Anyway, now all of those are going to show up with a reference point at the reference or at the mesh top of plane. So it's still not maybe a perfect solution, but if it's something like this where you're just replacing it in the end, it probably works just fine. I believe we can also do this with can we do it with the railing? You should be able to say gravity to mesh, yep, and start placing a railing. And it should find the top of that mesh as well. Right, so if I were to click on this, oh, it doesn't seem to like that. Well, I know I've used that for site walls before, but for whatever reason, maybe it's because there's not any contours or something. I'm not sure. Or maybe I have to replace it every click. But yeah, the gravity to mesh has been really useful for quickly modeling accurately on site and terrain elements, or even roof elements. If you have like a roof vent object, we have some of those in our library, in the Walker Warner library. You can place those directly to the roof and not have to fish around with where they're at in section. It does not associate them, so if you were to move it, it maintains its original position. It's not going to shift up and down as it moves around, though. So that's an important thing to denote. Guidelines are another important one, very useful for developing accurate models, right? I can snap a temporary guideline that's a non-print line, move it to that point. They can build up over time, and I have found actually, even on these M3 computers, there is a breaking point. It's pretty absurd. It's something like 10,000 guidelines in a single view will essentially tank Archicad. But if you don't clear them out, that's not exactly unrealistic over the life of a project to just build those up. Especially if it's something that's sort of off to the side or maybe not part of the main floor plan view, if it's part of a worksheet or something like that. We ran into this because we had a detail sheet where everything was lined up across, and there was just so many guidelines and things started getting slow. And it really slows down actually, even just after a few hundred guidelines. But the project will not function if you reach that sort of whatever several thousand mark. But even a couple hundred is going to really slow down the viewpoint. But guidelines are useful for finding those intersections. You can grab these intersections right here, figure out exactly where they come together. When you're done, there's a few things with the guidelines. You can right click and erase guidelines, remove all guidelines. If you have a whole bunch and you want to keep most of them, you can right click and remove just that one guideline. You can right click and erase specific guidelines, and it's going to give you that erase option until you hit escape, or you can just right click and clear all guidelines. It's a local data thing. But when you do send and receive, they can be stored depending on the view and permissions. I think they're tied to a couple of things on the BIM server. Just don't let them stack up. It's like trace references, right? They're really useful, but just don't use them as like a permanent long-term solution. Yeah, Miko, you have a question?
For the guidelines, is erase and remove the same thing
Yes, the
in
difference.
terms of like a data store?
Yeah, it's basically the difference is whether or not you need to remove multiple. So if I click on one and say remove that guideline, it's just going to pull that one. If I have like say there's like 300 guidelines in a view and it's starting to get slow and I just want to start picking apart the ones I don't need, you can go to the sorry, to get a couple of them here. You can go to the erase guidelines function, and that's going to let you just start clicking on the various guidelines that you want to remove. And then once you get it down to
Cool.
just what you need, then you hit escape. So you don't have to right click and say remove, right click, remove, right click, remove. You can just hit the erase and start going
Hmm,
click, click, click.
cool. Thanks.
There's also this really, there's always another way to do something in Archicad. There's this, originally the guidelines, you had to drag them up here and manually remove them. Which is, I mean, just know that that's still an option. All right, any other questions? Thoughts? Any other idea? Oh, there's another thing that y'all should be aware of. If you're ever wondering whether something's orthogonal or not, obviously, like you could use the measure function. It's going to give you that angle. But let's just say that like it seems like it should be horizontal. This is probably a bad example. It's really actually let's do this. I'm just gonna do this and then do a marquee and I'll pull this up like 128th of an inch, right? So if I were to measure this, it's probably still going to say that that's 0 degrees. Um, However, if I have, let me just draw this in and I'll dimension it. Right. So now if I dimension this side and the other side, um, depending on the level of precision of the dimension style, I could potentially get different dimensions here versus there. Right? So there we see it. It's 1910 versus 1909 and 63/64. It can be a real pain to try and figure out where that 64th is, right? So if I were to bring this down 128th of an inch, or sorry, no, up, right? It might report that this is now ortho or all even, right? However, there is this tool. I think most people know about it. Shoot, this is not our template. Bear with me for 1 second here. I'm gonna grab the ortho check label. With the new template coming out, I'm doing a lot of like out of the box matching kind of stuff. So I don't have our template up on this computer right now. Okay, so I'm just gonna dump that into here. This was developed, gosh, almost 10 years ago now. Anyway, uh, so there is this ortho check label, and you can actually attach that to these elements. It'll show red in our template, or green if it's all okay. And one thing that you can do is if that ortho check label is the default label type, so here I set that as the label type, you can select all walls in your project, go to document, uh, and label selected elements. Oh, I think because got dimensions selected there, it probably doesn't want to. Oh no, it did. Oh, it's just the text. Yeah, this is out of the box nonsense. Anyway, so you can see here that this wall and this wall are not orthogonal. So then I would have to actually go through and figure out how to get this to match. Sometimes you can just pull that down. You see there, now that's reporting okay. And I can see that now the dimensions aren't okay. So you can kind of pick this apart and figure out how to get things to line back up and be even and orthogonal. And this ortho check label is a great tool. When I run an audit, that's one of the things I do is I just label every single wall in the project with this ortho check label and do a find and select for any of the labels that have the text okay and delete those. And then the ones that report the actual angles, I usually just leave on the Archicad layer for teams to clean up later. But even if you're just going through and you're getting dimensions that don't quite add up, things aren't jiving well, you can just really quickly blanket those ortho check labels and sort of pick apart where the model's out of ortho. Okay. Any other questions?
Real quick, how do you get the little drafting guides toolbar again? I think I missed that.
Yeah, it's under Windows, toolbars, and drafting aids. Another thing that I find helpful, I have a shortcut in my work environment for the cursor projection. I know a lot of people don't like it. If you don't have the shortcut, the only way to get to it with any default work environment is to have the rulers on, and then there's cursor projection. It's not necessarily the most useful for accurate modeling, but if things are off by, several inches, if I pull this down 3 inches or even 1.5 inches or something, um, you could see graphically that that's where it's off. So it can be helpful, especially when you're talking about like really small details or large scale details rather. Um, anyway. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now, but if anybody else has questions, feel free. Where do I stop the recording?